I was about to put pen to paper and sign the transfer dossier that would hand my entire company over to my son, Darius Cross. At that exact moment, my daughter-in-law, Simone Cross, stepped forward with a radiant smile and offered me a still-hot cup of coffee, gentle as if she truly cared. But only a second later, Marlene Booker, the housekeeper who had been with my family for years, accidentally brushed my hand. That touch, which seemed clumsy at first, came with a trembling whisper, enough to send ice down my spine. "Don't drink it. Please trust me." I didn't have time to ask why. I only knew Marlene's eyes didn't look like someone who had just slipped up. They looked like the eyes of someone trying to save my life. So, in a moment when no one was paying attention, I secretly switched my cup of coffee with Simone's. Only 5 minutes later, Simone began, "I'm so glad you're here. Follow my story all the way to the end and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. And if you think this is just a small accident in a family meeting, you're about to be shocked. Because what happened next was the moment I realized someone in my own house wanted me gone." My name is Vivian Cross. I am 64 years old this year. At this age, I used to think I had lived long enough to recognize every kind of betrayal life could serve up. I used to think I was immune to being stabbed in the back. But I was wrong, because the worst thing sometimes doesn't arrive in the shape of an enemy. It arrives as a family meeting on a Tuesday morning in October, wrapped in a smile and placed into my hands as a cup of coffee that had been prepared to become the last cup of my life. But before I tell you about that fateful morning, I need to tell you about the man I lost, about the son I once believed I understood, and about the woman who saved my life when no one else could. 15 years ago, my husband, Robert Cross, died of a heart attack right at his office. He was only 52, and the most painful part was, we had celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary exactly 1 week before. I still remember that morning vividly. Robert made me coffee like he did every day. Medium roast Colombian coffee, little sugar, lots of milk. He kissed my cheek, then smiled. "See you tonight, Mrs. Cross." That was the last time I heard his voice. At 11 in the morning, the phone rang. I was in a meeting at the time. Robert's assistant's voice was shaking. "Mrs. Cross, he collapsed right at his desk. The ambulance is on the way." But it was too late. Robert died on the way to MedStar Georgetown Hospital. His heart couldn't take any more strain. At the funeral, Darius Cross, my son, who was 24 then, held me tight and cried like a child. He said, his voice breaking, "Mom, I'll take care of you. I promise. I will never let you face everything alone." Back then, that promise sounded sincere, or at least, I believed it was. After Robert passed, I was forced to shoulder Cross Industries, the medical equipment manufacturing company my husband had built over 20 years. I wasn't a technical person. Before I got married, I was an art teacher. But Robert had taught me a great deal about business over the years we lived together, and I couldn't let his life's work disappear just because I was afraid. Over the past 15 years, I turned Cross Industries from a small company worth $3 million into a $12 million business. Not bad for a widow who used to only know charity events and dinner parties, right? Darius had worked at the company for 5 years. I won't lie and say my son was so brilliant that people were blown away. But he was my son, my family, and I believed that family still meant something. Then, 2 years ago, Simone Cross appeared. The first time Darius brought Simone home, I was genuinely surprised. She was beautiful in a framed kind of way. Shiny blonde hair, smooth fair skin, a Hollywood-style smile. But what impressed me even more was her intelligence. Simone had a master's degree in chemistry and had worked at a major pharmaceutical company. Before introducing her, Darius even told me as if he wanted me to feel completely reassured. "You're going to like her, Mom. She's smart, ambitious, and most importantly, she loves me." And I liked Simone. Or rather, I was fooled by her. Simone always knew exactly what to say, what I wanted to hear. She complimented the outfits I chose. She remembered my birthday. She asked about my health with a concern that felt very convincing. Every time she visited, she brought small gifts that looked thoughtful. The tea I liked, a silk scarf in exactly the color I loved. After marrying Darius, Simone joined the company as the marketing director. She worked efficiently, charming when needed, and she had a very strange ability, making anyone in front of her feel like they were her special person. Even me. But there was one person who never trusted Simone. That was Marlene Booker. Marlene had worked for my family for 20 years. She started back when Darius was still in college. At that time, Marlene was 32, an immigrant woman from Jamaica, quiet, hardworking, sending money home every day to support her daughter back in her homeland. Robert and I cared for Marlene like family. When her daughter got sick and needed surgery, we paid the full cost. When Marlene wanted to bring her daughter to the United States, we helped her with the paperwork too. Marlene was the kind of person who stayed quiet, but made you feel safe. Her graying hair was always tied neatly in a bun at the back of her head. She worked neatly, cleanly, never speaking unnecessarily. She understood what I wanted, sometimes before I even said it. She knew exactly how I liked my coffee. She knew I hated yellow tulips because they reminded me of my mother's funeral. She knew I needed silence in the morning before I was ready to speak to anyone. But over the past 2 years, I noticed Marlene changing. She became anxious whenever Darius and Simone came over. She always found ways to leave the room when they were present. And sometimes I caught Marlene looking at Simone, not with hatred, but with fear. Once I asked, "Marlene, are you okay?" She answered very quickly, so quickly that it felt unnatural. "Yes, Mrs. Cross, it's just, my daughter is about to take her college entrance exams, and I'm a little worried, that's all." I didn't press further. Now, thinking back, I should have. I should have pulled her into a chair, looked straight into her eyes, and kept asking until she told me the truth. 3 months ago, I started feeling tired in a very strange way. At first, I blamed my age. 64, after all. My body wasn't what it used to be. But then the symptoms grew, little by little, as if someone were turning down my strength every day. Morning nausea, dizziness when I stood up, persistent headaches, weak arms and legs. I couldn't focus in meetings. The numbers on financial reports blurred in front of my eyes like fog. Simone said, in that perfectly concerned tone, "You look so exhausted, Mom. You should see a doctor. We have to make sure you're healthy." Darius also acted caring. "You're too stressed, Mom. Maybe you should think about resting more, and let Simone and me handle the work." I went to the doctor. The doctor ran every test: blood pressure, blood sugar, liver and kidney function. Everything was normal. And then the doctor concluded, "Maybe it's stress, Mrs. Cross. At your age, running a large company can create significant pressure." I believed it. I believed it because it made sense, and because Darius and Simone also made me believe it was just something normal. But Marlene didn't. I began to notice. The worst dizzy spells always happened on mornings when Simone arrived early. My daughter-in-law had a habit of coming by before 9 on days with important meetings, saying she wanted to help prepare. And Simone would often make my coffee herself on those mornings. She would say sweetly, "Let me handle it, Mom. Marlene already has too much to do." Every time I drank the coffee Simone made, I felt worse. But I hadn't connected all the dots. How could I suspect that my daughter-in-law, the woman who always smiled brightly, who always said, "I love you, Mom," every time she left, could slowly poison me? Marlene knew, but she didn't dare to say it. If you've made it this far and you're starting to feel chills, believe me, that feeling is nothing yet. Because the most terrifying part wasn't that I was tired, dizzy. It was that someone in my own home had turned the most familiar things into weapons. A cup of coffee, a smile, "You should rest, Mom." All of it could be a cover. And I lived under that cover for 3 months, until that Tuesday morning in October, until that morning when Marlene had no choice left. That Tuesday morning, Darius called me. "Mom, Simone and I want to hold a family meeting at your house." His voice carried that exact tone he used whenever he thought he was being mature and responsible. I knew that tone. Robert had used it back in the day, too. Darius continued slowly, as if reading from a rehearsed script. "Simone and I have been thinking about the succession plan. We need to discuss some important changes related to the company's future, so everyone understands clearly." I agreed, of course. At my age, thinking about who would take over when I retired was reasonable. I thought we would talk about timing, about whether Darius was ready to carry more responsibility, maybe a serious training program. Step by step. I was naive. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning at my house in Georgetown. I had lived there for over 30 years, and strangely, every time I opened the door and stepped inside, I still felt like Robert might appear at any moment, as if he were just a few minutes late because of traffic. The living room, where we planned to meet, had once been Robert's favorite place. Dark wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a wall full of family photos, capturing the times when we still believed happiness was something you could keep forever. I woke up early as usual, and the first thing was always coffee. Always coffee. I had been drinking the same kind for decades. Dark roast Colombian coffee, the kind Robert introduced to me on our honeymoon. Marlene knew exactly how I liked it brewed, to the point I never had to remind her even once. That morning, sitting in the living room and flipping through a few quarterly reports, I suddenly felt restless without knowing why. Cross Industries was running well, better than well. Over the past 6 months, we had just signed 3 major contracts, and our profit margin was the highest it had been in years. And yet, something wasn't right. I could feel it in the air, like the feeling right before a storm. There's no rain yet, but your skin already knows something is coming. At exactly 10, Darius arrived. He was wearing an expensive suit, the kind I was sure cost more than Marlene's monthly paycheck. Darius always took care of his appearance. He had inherited his father's tall build and black hair, but he hadn't inherited Robert's warm eyes. "Hi, Mom." Darius kissed my cheek, but the kiss was mechanical, a polite ritual that had replaced real affection a long time ago. "Simone will be here any minute. She stopped to buy the pastries you like from the bakery downtown." "So thoughtful," I replied, still smiling. Though inside, I wondered, for a meeting about the company's future, why did we need pastries, as if we were throwing a party? 15 minutes later, Simone arrived. She was always that polished. A cream blazer, a navy dress, blonde hair curled perfectly like she had just walked out of an advertisement. In her hands was a small white box tied with ribbon and an insulated bag, holding 3 cups of coffee. "Vivian, my dear mother." Simone set everything down on the coffee table and hugged me. The hug was a little too tight, a little too long, longer than was comfortable for me. "I brought fresh coffee from a new cafe on Newberry Street. I know you like trying coffee brewed in new styles." I found it strange. Simone knew Marlene had already made my morning pot of coffee. But I still smiled and thanked her. Simone was always thoughtful in a way that made me feel cared for, and yet also like I was being managed. Simone handed me a cup of coffee in my favorite blue ceramic mug, the mug from my mother's set. She knew I preferred it over my everyday cups. "This is wonderful," I said, taking it. "You're always so thoughtful." Darius sat down in the armchair across from me. Simone chose the sofa right beside my chair, so close that if she leaned, she could touch my hand. She placed herself where she could watch both of us, and I noticed her eyes flicking back and forth as if measuring reactions. I took a sip. The coffee tasted completely different from what I was used to. Slightly bitter, with an aftertaste. That was hard to name. Not the normal kind of pleasant bitterness. It left my throat feeling mildly dry and irritated. "So," I began, trying to keep my voice calm, "you said you wanted to discuss the succession plan." Darius leaned forward, hands clasped. "Yes, Mom. Simone and I have talked. We think it's time you step back from daily operations. You've worked hard for too long. You deserve to retire." The way he said it made me feel like I was too old, too tired, too past my expiration date. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. "I understand you're worried about me," I said slowly, "but I'm still capable of running the company, and the numbers show I'm still doing it right." "Of course," Simone cut in immediately, her voice warm and soothing in that reassuring way. "You've built an incredible legacy. But Darius and I want to make sure that legacy is protected and expanded. We have some ideas for growth, some new markets we can tap into." As she spoke, I saw Marlene moving around behind us. She wiped furniture that wasn't dirty, straightened picture frames that were already aligned. Her movements were restless, like someone trying to look busy to hide something. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I saw fear in hers. Real fear. "What kind of expansion?" I asked, then took another sip of coffee. The bitterness grew sharper, and suddenly I felt a strange heat spread up into my chest. Darius launched into a long talk about international markets, manufacturing partners, growth strategy. He spoke fast, excitedly, as if he had been waiting for this day for a long time. But while listening, my head started to feel light. Not the clear kind, but the uncomfortable kind. A sickly float. I told myself it was just strong coffee. I tried to focus. But Simone wasn't focused on Darius. She was watching me, watching closely, for a long time. When our eyes met, Simone smiled, perfect as always. But this time, I suddenly saw something behind it, something I had never wanted to see. Not warmth, not love, but anticipation. "The thing is, Mom," Darius continued, "we need you to sign some paperwork today to start this process. The authority transfer forms, updated partner agreements, things like that." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "I know it looks like a lot, but our lawyer has reviewed everything. This is just procedure to get started." I reached out to take the documents and realized my hand felt strangely heavy, as if my body were moving slower than my thoughts. The heat in my chest spread, and the dizziness returned, stronger this time. "I think I need to review these carefully before I sign anything," I said. Even hearing my own voice sounded strange to me, like it was echoing from far away. "Of course," Simone said quickly, then stood up like someone who had just spotted an opportunity to care. "But maybe you should finish your coffee first. You look a little pale." And right then, Marlene appeared beside my chair, carrying a tray of clean silverware, something that clearly didn't need to be brought out right now. She bent down to set it on the side table. Then, as if she tripped, she stumbled and accidentally braced herself against my hand. My coffee cup tipped. The rest spilled out, onto my lap and down onto the floor. "Oh no, Mrs. Cross, I'm so sorry," Marlene blurted out, and her voice was nothing like a normal accident. It was full of emotion, full of desperation. She dropped to her knees to wipe it up. But before she fully bent down, Marlene looked straight into my eyes and whispered, so softly only I could hear, "Don't drink anymore. Please trust me." My entire body went cold, not because the coffee spilled, but because of the urgency in her voice. In 20 years, Marlene had never lost her composure over anything. The fear in her eyes was real, and it made my blood feel like it froze. "Marlene, why are you being so clumsy?" Simone snapped. For just a moment, her perfectly composed mask cracked. "That was a whole set. You know how much Mrs. Cross treasures that mug." "It's fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though a strange numbness had started creeping in, like my awareness was being wrapped in cotton. Marlene's warning rang inside me like an alarm, and at the same time, my business instinct, the instinct that had kept Cross Industries alive for 15 years, spoke up. When someone tells you, "Trust me," it means there's something you haven't seen yet. "It was just an accident," I said, looking at Simone calmly. "Anyone can slip." Simone immediately picked up her own cup, about to pour into mine. "Here, let me share mine with you. You barely drank anything, and you know how you'll feel if you don't have your morning coffee." But the moment she lifted her cup, Marlene tripped again. This time she bumped directly into Simone's hand. Coffee splashed everywhere, spraying across the table. And worst of all, it soaked into the stack of legal documents Darius had just laid out. "Marlene!" Darius shouted, springing to his feet. "What is wrong with you today?" I'm sorry, Mr. Darius," Marlene stammered. But when she looked at me, I saw something completely different in her eyes. No more panic. Relief. While the whole room was in chaos cleaning up, I noticed Simone suddenly went very quiet. She stared at the coffee stains on the paperwork as if it were a disaster. Not because the documents were dirty, but because the plan had slipped off track. When Simone looked up and saw me watching, she forced a smile. "Oh, wow, what a mess." Her laugh sounded strained. "Maybe we should postpone the meeting and get new copies of the documents." "Actually," I said, and I surprised myself because my mind suddenly felt clearer even though my body still felt sick. "I want to review them right now, even with the coffee stains." Darius hesitated for a beat. "Of course, but it's a bit hard to read now." I picked up the documents. My vision blurred slightly, as if there were a thin mist in front of my eyes, but I still flipped through, trying to read the key lines. I also noticed Marlene stayed in the room, pretending to straighten books, but really listening to every word. Then Simone reached toward the coffee pot, about to pour again, and that's when I saw something unusual. Simone's hand was shaking so much she almost couldn't hold the pot. This was a woman who had never shown anxiety in any meeting, a woman who could stand in front of an entire boardroom and stay smooth as water. "Simone, are you okay?" I asked. This time I truly meant it, even though my suspicion had begun to grow. "Oh, I'm fine," Simone answered quickly, setting the pot down without pouring. "Just a little tired." But her face began to flush. Her eyes lost focus, like she couldn't lock onto a single point. She swallowed hard, then braced her hand on the sofa. I think I need to lie down for a moment," Simone said, her voice weakening, drifting. Darius immediately rushed over, all his attention snapping to his wife. "Baby, what's wrong? Should I call a doctor?" Simone tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't lift. She collapsed back onto the sofa, her skin turning pale, sweat beading on her forehead. "I feel strange, like everything is spinning," she whispered. At that moment, Marlene stepped forward, and with just one look, I knew she understood exactly what was happening. "Mrs. Simone," Marlene said, her voice strangely calm. "When was the last time you ate anything today?" I ate breakfast," Simone replied, but her lips began to stiffen, her words slurring. I'm so dizzy." Then suddenly, Simone's body stiffened, and after that, she started convulsing. Not dramatic like the movies, nothing pretty or neat about it. It was terrifying and brutally real, her body jerking uncontrollably, Darius grabbing her and screaming her name like a panicked child. "Call 911, I tried to say, but my voice sounded warped. Darius's trembling fingers dialed. As the ringing sounded, I looked at Marlene. She stood still, no panic, no screaming, just watching what was happening with an expression that was dark and heavy. Not shock, but a kind of grim satisfaction, like someone who had just seen a trap snap shut exactly where it was supposed to. And in that exact moment, when the distant wail of an ambulance began to rise, when Simone was still convulsing on my sofa, I suddenly understood, with a clarity so chilling it made my skin crawl. That cup of coffee was never meant for Simone. The cup Marlene had deliberately spilled was meant for me. The woman convulsing in front of me had just drunk the very thing she brought, and in a single breath I realized I had just escaped death because of an accident that was anything but accidental. If you're thinking, so what was in the coffee? Then believe me, I asked myself that exact question in that moment too. But what truly made my spine go cold wasn't only Simone convulsing. It was what happened next. Because when the ambulance arrived, when everyone panicked, when Darius looked like he was about to shatter, I looked at the coffee-stained documents and understood. This meeting was never about succession. It was a transfer, literally, and I had been set up to sign it while I was no longer clear-minded enough to understand what I was doing. The siren grew closer. Darius held Simone, his face ashen, his hands shaking so hard the phone almost slipped. And I, though my body was still burning hot and my head still felt floaty, felt something rise stronger than all of it, the clarity of someone who had survived her husband's death and kept a company standing for 15 years. And I knew from this moment on, I would no longer look at Darius and Simone through a mother's eyes. The ambulance ride to MedStar Georgetown Hospital felt endless to me, even though I knew for certain it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. I sat in the back beside Darius, watching the paramedics work around Simone as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her face was ash gray. Even with an oxygen mask covering nearly half her face, Simone's breathing was still shallow and labored, as if every breath had to be paid for with a little of her last remaining strength. Darius gripped his wife's hand tightly, repeating over and over, "You're going to be okay, baby. You're going to be okay." But one thing chilled me more than Simone's condition. Darius's voice lacked real panic. He seemed concerned, yes, but more like an actor reading lines than a husband watching his wife fight for her life. That calm wasn't composure. It was something rehearsed. In my mind, one image kept looping again and again. Marlene's warning and the way she had accidentally spilled the coffee far too deliberately. In 20 years of working together, Marlene had never been clumsy. Never. She dusted priceless antiques, handled porcelain as thin as flower petals, moved through our home with the precision of someone who understood the value of everything she touched. And yet this morning she had stumbled twice in a row, and both times happened at the exact moment Simone was about to pour coffee for me. At the hospital, Simone was rushed straight into the emergency room. Darius and I were guided to the waiting area, a place that smelled of disinfectant mixed with fear. The fluorescent lights were harsh, making everything look rigid and cold, and under that light, Darius's face looked more hollow, more unfamiliar. Darius paced back and forth in the small space like a caged animal. "I should call her parents," he said. "They need to know what happened." I looked my son directly in the eye. "What are you going to tell them?" Darius stopped and turned to me. "The truth. She fainted at your house and we don't know why." But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Simone fainted after drinking the cup of coffee that had been meant for me. The whole truth was that it could have been poison, and my daughter-in-law might be dying from the weapon she prepared for me. About an hour later, a doctor appeared. A woman in her 40s, looking tired but with kind eyes, her face serious like someone who had seen too many tragedies in a single long day. "Are you family of Simone Cross?" "I'm her husband," Darius said immediately. "And this is my mother. How is she?" "She's stable for now," the doctor replied. "But we're running expanded blood work. Her symptoms suggest the possibility that she ingested some kind of toxin. Has she taken any unfamiliar medication, supplements, or been exposed to any cleaning agents today?" Darius shook his head instantly, so fast it was almost reflex. "Nothing unusual. We only drank coffee and discussed work, and then she suddenly got dizzy and fainted." The doctor wrote a note, then looked up. "Where did the coffee come from?" "Simone brought it from a new cafe on Newbury Street," Darius answered. "But my mother and I drank it too, and we're fine." Except that wasn't true. I had barely drunk any before Marlene spilled my cup, and even the little I did drink was enough to make me dizzy, unsteady, disoriented. Those effects slowly faded during the ambulance ride, leaving my mind clearer and clearer, and a cold certainty someone had tried to kill me. The doctor continued, "We'll need to test any remaining coffee or food from the meeting. If this was intentional poisoning, the police will get involved. I saw Darius's jaw tighten, a small movement almost imperceptible, but I saw it. "Of course, whatever you need," Darius said smoothly. The moment the doctor walked away, Darius immediately pulled out his phone, his fingers moving very fast. "I have to call Marlene, tell her to clean up the mess from this morning before the police come to the house." I looked up and said softly, but clearly, "No." Darius froze. "What did you say?" I said, "Don't clean. I want everything kept exactly as it is." My son's eyes sharpened. "Why?" "Because if someone intentionally poisoned Simone, the evidence could be in the very things from this morning. If we clean everything up, what will the police even look for?" Darius stared at me for a long time, and in that stare, I saw something flicker across his face. Not confusion, but calculation. "You think someone deliberately poisoned her?" Darius asked, his voice lower. I stayed calm. "I think we shouldn't conclude anything until the test results are back." But inside me, the conclusion had already formed as clearly as a line drawn in ink. Someone tried to poison me, and Simone drank it instead. The only question was Darius part of that plan, or was he innocent the way he was acting? I told Darius I needed to use the restroom, but instead of turning into the bathroom, I walked straight out into the hallway, where there was just enough quiet to hear my own heartbeat. And I called Marlene. She answered after the first ring, as if she had been sitting by the phone. "Mrs. Cross, how is Mrs. Simone?" "She's alive, Marlene," I said, my voice dropping lower. "Not thanks to the coffee this morning." There was a long silence on the other end. Then finally, Marlene spoke, barely above a whisper. "You need to know some things, Mrs. Cross. Things I've seen, and things I should have told you earlier." "What things?" I asked, my throat dry and burning. "Can we meet somewhere truly private?" "Not at the house," Marlene said faster, more tense. "Mr. Darius said today he would fire me for being clumsy, and I don't think it's safe to talk where he might hear." My heart started pounding wildly. "Where?" "There's a small cafe called Marley's on Commonwealth Avenue, about 6 blocks from the hospital. I can be there in 20 minutes. I held my breath. "Marlene, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Marlene's voice caught. Then she said the words that made my whole world tilt. "I'm saying Mrs. Simone has been putting something into your morning coffee for weeks, and today was supposed to be the final dose." She swallowed hard. "And I'm also saying I wrote everything down, and you're in more danger than you think." The line went dead. I stood frozen on the busy sidewalk outside the hospital, like someone who had been yanked out of a dream and dropped straight into a fully awake nightmare. Weeks. Simone had been poisoning me, slowly, carefully, methodically. And this morning was supposed to be the end. I went back to the waiting area in a daze. Everything in front of me was still normal, people walking, the loudspeaker calling patient names, but inside my head, the order of my life had been torn apart. And then I saw Darius. He was on the phone, standing slightly in a hidden corner, his voice low and urgent. "No. Everything went wrong. Now she's in the hospital, and the police are going to investigate." I stopped immediately. Just one sentence, but enough to reveal far too much. Darius saw me approaching and ended the call instantly, so fast it was almost panicked. "Just work," he said smoothly. "I have to cancel a few meetings this afternoon." But I had heard enough to know. The person he was talking to wasn't anyone from the office. Darius wasn't surprised about the police. He was speaking like someone who had anticipated there could be a mistake and had already prepared for the police getting involved. I sat down beside him, keeping my voice steady. The same voice I used in boardrooms when I had to face betrayal without showing it. "Darius, I need you to be completely honest with me about something." Darius turned, and for one brief moment, his mask slipped. I saw fear in his eyes, but I also saw something else, a dark streak of resentment. "What do you want to know?" he asked. I looked straight at my son, not avoiding his gaze. How long have you been planning to take the company? Darius went still. What are you talking about? I didn't back down. I mean, how long have you been waiting for me to die so you could inherit everything? The question hung between us like a heavy object. I watched Darius's face cycle through expressions in rapid succession. Shock, hurt, anger, and then finally something that made my skin crawl. Almost relief. I would never want anything bad to happen to you. You know that, Darius said. But he answered too quickly, and that voice was back. That fake voice I had recognized in the ambulance. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation before. If you're thinking, so whose side is Darius really on? I only wish I had the answer right then. But one thing was certain. When someone has just watched his wife nearly die and still speaks like he's reading lines, that's no longer calm. That's hiding. And right after my question, Darius did something small, but enough to make me understand. This battle wasn't only inside the hospital. It had been inside my own family for a long time. 20 minutes later, I sat across from Marlene in a small cafe, dim yellow lights thick with the scent of cinnamon mixed with stale coffee. The place was quiet. The sound of a spoon tapping a glass was painfully clear. Marlene looked much older than 52, her face gaunt, her eyes red from sleeplessness, and within her worry there was something that looked like guilt. She didn't stall. I should have told you sooner, Marlene said right away, her voice hoarse. But at first I wasn't sure. Then I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. I looked straight at her, no longer allowing myself to avoid it. Tell me right now, Marlene. Marlene opened her handbag, took out a small notebook, and set it on the table between us as if placing down evidence. I started writing everything down about 3 months ago, she said, from the moment I saw Mrs. Simone do something. Not normal. She opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates, times, detailed notes. Every morning you drink coffee in the living room while reading the paper, Marlene continued. For 20 years I made it the same way, same coffee, same cup, carried on the same tray. But 3 months ago, Mrs. Simone started coming early on the mornings you had meetings. I remembered clearly. The time Simone arrived before 9, saying she wanted to help prepare, then naturally took over the coffee, as if she were the one caring for me. At the time, I even thought it was thoughtful. At first I thought she just wanted to help. Marlene flipped through a few pages. But then I realized you started getting sick on those exact mornings. Dizzy, nauseous, weak, unable to focus. You said it was stress, but those symptoms only happened when Mrs. Simone was the one handling your coffee. She pointed to a page packed with dates and symptoms, stretching continuously across 3 months, a cold log like a medical chart. It felt like someone had punched me straight in the stomach. 3 months, 90 days, nearly 100 cups of coffee, and in each cup, Simone was slowly killing me. So I started paying closer attention, Marlene said, her voice trembling. About 6 weeks ago, there was a morning when I pretended to be busy in the pantry, but I could see into the kitchen through the service window. I saw Mrs. Simone holding a small vial of clear liquid. She dropped a few drops into your coffee before stirring. My stomach clenched. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of trusting a woman who was mixing something into my coffee day after day. I gripped the strap of my bag, fighting to keep my voice from breaking. Why didn't you tell me then? Tears welled in Marlene's eyes. Because I was afraid, Mrs. Cross. She swallowed hard. Mr. Darius threatened to fire me twice just because I asked too many questions about company matters. He said I was too curious for a housekeeper. I was afraid if I accused his wife of poisoning you without proof, he wouldn't just fire me, he would make sure I could never work anywhere again. I nodded, and in that moment I understood. Marlene wasn't disloyal. She had been cornered with no way out. So you started keeping records, I said slowly. Yes, I started keeping records, and I started taking pictures. Marlene took out her phone. She scrolled, then held the screen out to me. A series of photos appeared. Simone in the kitchen, her hand reaching into her handbag. Simone standing beside my cup, holding something very small in her hand. Simone stirring the coffee, her face coldly focused, no smile, no dutiful daughter-in-law warmth. In those photos, Simone was completely different from the woman I thought I knew. No radiant smile, no fake warmth, only calculation, the calculation of someone perfecting her technique. "This morning," Marlene said, her voice catching, "I saw her add more drops than usual, much more, and I also heard her on the phone with Mr. Darius earlier. She said everything would end today. I knew for sure. Today wasn't going to be just a few symptoms. Today was the final dose." Marlene's tears fell, streaming down her cheeks. "I couldn't let her kill you, Mrs. Cross. You treated me well for 20 years. You helped me when my daughter was sick, paid for her surgery when I couldn't afford it. You treated me like family, while my real family was thousands of miles away." I reached across the table and took her hand. Marlene's hand was cold and shaking. "You saved my life." Marlene shook her head, her voice on the verge of breaking. "But Mrs. Simone—" "Simone is alive," I said firmly, "and she will pay for what she intended to do to me." Marlene squeezed my hand tighter. "There's more, Mrs. Cross, about Mr. Darius." She flipped to another section of the notebook. This page made my blood run cold. "He met with a lawyer to discuss changing your will. He bought life insurance on you without you knowing, and he has been moving money from company accounts into accounts only he can access." The blade of betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined. Darius wasn't just waiting for me to die. He had actively prepared everything as if he were scheduling my death. I took a very deep breath. "How much did he move?" Marlene glanced at her notes. "From the papers I saw in the office, at least $200,000 over 6 months, possibly more." $200,000. Enough to hire people, enough to silence mouths, enough to cover tracks, enough to fund a methodical murder plot. I lifted my chin, my voice slow but leaving no room for argument. "Marlene, I need you to do one thing. Gather all the evidence, the notebook, the photos, everything, and take it straight to the police. Don't go home. Don't call anyone. Go straight to the station." Marlene turned pale. "And what about you, Mrs. Cross?" "I'm going back to the hospital to wait for the test results. If they confirm Simone was poisoned, there will be a long list of questions Darius won't be able to answer." We stood up. Marlene grabbed my arm, her nails pressing lightly from fear. "Mrs. Cross, please be careful. If Mr. Darius realizes you know what they planned—" I looked her directly in the eye. "He won't dare do anything to me in a hospital full of witnesses." I paused, then added firmly, "But you're different. After you speak to the police, don't go home. Stay somewhere safe until everything is clear." I walked back into MedStar Georgetown Hospital with the clearest mind I'd had in months. The dizziness, the confusion, the persistent weakness weren't from old age or stress. They were signs of something designed to gnaw at me little by little. When I returned to the waiting area, Darius was still sitting in the same place I'd left him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a man in an expensive suit. His face, posture, and the leather briefcase in his hand said one thing plainly: a lawyer. "Mom," Darius stood when he saw me. "This is Preston Hale. He's our family lawyer. I think, given what happened to Simone, we should have legal representation." Preston Hale extended his hand, a smile that looked practiced in the mirror. "Mrs. Cross, I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances. Darius called me because he's concerned someone might try to blame your family for what happened to Simone." I didn't shake his hand right away. I looked straight at him. "Why would anyone blame us?" I asked, genuinely wanting to hear how they planned to build the story. Preston spoke carefully. "If the police determine Simone was intentionally poisoned, they will examine everyone who had access to whatever she consumed. Since this happened at your home during a family meeting, everyone present could be considered a suspect." A very clean move. Bring in a lawyer early to position their family as victims of an investigation instead of perpetrators of a plot. I nodded slightly. That sounds reasonable. I think it's best that all of us prepare to answer their questions, truthfully. Darius and Preston exchanged a very quick look, a look that was enough for me to understand. They already had their truthful version prepared. Just then, Dr. Martinez returned. This time her face was more serious than before. Mrs. Cross, Mr. Cross, I need to talk to you about the test results. We followed her into a small consultation room that felt more like an interrogation room than a medical office. Dr. Martinez didn't waste words. Your wife was poisoned with arsenic, a significant dose, one that could have been fatal if she hadn't received emergency treatment in time. The police have been notified, and they will want to interview everyone who was present when she consumed the substance that contained the poison. Darius's face visibly paled, but his voice still tried to stay steady. Arsenic? How could that... That is what the investigation will determine. In the meantime, Mrs. Cross also needs to be closely monitored. Arsenic poisoning can have long-term effects, and we want to make sure you are properly tested and treated. I asked, my voice so calm that even I surprised myself. Will Simone recover? Yes, if treated correctly. She's lucky it was discovered and addressed very quickly. Lucky? If Simone knew that luck came from a deliberate stumble and Marlene's whisper. As we left the consultation room, Darius immediately pulled Preston aside, his voice lowered but urgent. What do we do now? But Preston looked at me first, his eyes measuring. Mrs. Cross, do you have any idea how arsenic could have gotten into what your daughter-in-law consumed? I recognized it instantly. A test. They wanted to know how far my suspicion went. Wanted to know what I had heard from Marlene. Wanted to know whether I had become a hole in the story they were building. I smiled very slightly, the smile of someone who had sat at negotiation tables with people who wore politeness on the outside while holding knives behind their backs. I have no idea, I said evenly, but I believe the police will find the truth. And they would, because Marlene, I was sure by now, was handing every piece of evidence to the detective, every photo, every line of notes, enough to tear every lie apart. Darius's phone rang. He stepped away to take it. I couldn't hear what was said, but I watched his expression change rapidly, from worry to panic, then to anger, all within seconds. He hung up and whipped around, eyes wild. We have a problem. The police just arrested Marlene for attempted murder. Preston nodded gravely, as if he had been waiting for that exact line to step into character. I suspected they might blame the housekeeper. In poisoning cases, she's the most convenient suspect. But I knew better. Marlene wasn't arrested just because she was convenient. She was arrested because Darius had discovered she went to the police, and he was trying to remove the only witness who could destroy his plan. Only one thing was different. Marlene was smart enough to back everything up. And very soon, Darius would realize the conspiracy he thought was perfect had now become evidence. The moment I heard Marlene had been arrested, I understood I had stepped into a dirtier game than I ever imagined. It was no longer just who put poison in the coffee. It was who could build the story first, who could turn the victim into the culprit fast enough. And in my mind there was only one question. If they were willing to throw Marlene in jail to silence her, then what would their next move against me be? The police station made me feel like I had stepped into an entirely different world, one where the soft lies I had lived with for months were stripped bare under cold, harsh fluorescent lights. No more polite smiles, no more polished words, only the truth, or the closest thing to truth people can tolerate. Detective Alana Pierce was a woman in her 40s, eyes sharp as knives, and patience earned only after years of sitting across from liars who still pretended to be innocent. She moved fast, decisive, as if she'd learned that one answer could save a life or send someone to prison. I drove here straight from the hospital, leaving Darius and his lawyer to handle whatever damage control games they thought were necessary. What they didn't know was that I had spoken with Marlene's public defender, and I had arranged for my own private attorney to represent her. If my son thought he could throw the woman who saved my life into prison as a scapegoat, then he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. "Mrs. Cross," Detective Pierce said as she led me into a small interview room, "thank you for coming in voluntarily. I understand this is a very difficult time for your family." I had no intention of wasting a single second. "Detective, before we begin, I need you to know one thing. Marlene Booker is innocent of trying to kill my daughter-in-law. In fact, she saved both of our lives this morning." Detective Pierce raised an eyebrow, opened a thick folder, and flipped pages as if turning through hundreds of tragic stories she had already heard. "That's an interesting assessment," she said evenly. "Can you tell me why you believe that?" So I told her. I told her everything, from the strange coffee Simone brought, to Marlene's deliberately clumsy spill, to the warning she whispered right into my ear, "Don't drink anymore. Please trust me." I told even the smallest details because I understood, inside rooms like this, sometimes a tiny detail can turn the entire case. When I finished, Detective Pierce stayed silent for a long time. The hum of the air conditioner sounded like the room's breathing. Then she said, slowly and clearly, "Mrs. Cross, what you're describing suggests someone attempted to poison you, and your daughter-in-law accidentally drank what was meant for you." "Yes," I answered immediately. "Exactly." "And you believe your son knew about this plan?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, one that, once spoken, could never be swallowed back down. I looked straight at the detective, feeling as if someone had tightened a hand around my throat. "I believe my son has been planning my death for months, possibly longer." Detective Pierce wrote, her pen moving fast across the paper, as if nailing each word down. "We've spoken with Marlene Booker," she said. "Her statement matches yours completely, and she has provided us with very thorough documentation of suspicious behavior she observed over the past 3 months." "What documentation?" I asked, though my heart had already begun pounding. "Photographs, detailed notes. There are even audio recordings of conversations between your son and his wife. Mrs. Cross, if what Marlene documented is accurate, you have been the victim of an attempted murder for quite some time." My hands started to shake. I laced my fingers together tightly, forcing myself not to collapse in front of anyone. Hearing the truth spoken aloud in the calm voice of a professional, it turned suspicion into something with shape, edges, weight. For months, Darius and Simone had been poisoning me slowly, while I still called them family, still let them into my life, still entrusted them with important decisions. "There's more," Detective Pierce continued. "We obtained a search warrant for your son's home and office. We found some things that are very concerning." She opened another folder and spread photographs in front of me, like placing a mirror up to betrayal. "There are multiple life insurance policies in your name, totaling $5 million, all purchased within the past year. Bank records show regular transfers from your business accounts into personal accounts controlled solely by your son. And this..." She handed me a clear evidence bag. Inside was a small glass vial with a dropper cap. "We found this hidden in your daughter-in-law's desk drawer at work." The lab confirmed it. Concentrated arsenic solution. I stared at the vial. Something so tiny, yet enough to end a person's entire life. One drop at a time, one morning at a time. "How much longer, if today hadn't happened?" I asked, my voice dry and rough. "Based on the dosage Marlene recorded, likely 2 to 3 weeks, Detective Pierce replied. "The symptoms you experienced, weakness, confusion, were signs arsenic was accumulating, and what was added to the coffee this morning was intended to be the final dose." The room suddenly felt colder, even though the station was hot and airless. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, like someone had just read out the date and time of my death. "So now, what happens?" I asked. "We're going to arrest your son, and we will formally charge your daughter-in-law with attempted murder and conspiracy. With the evidence Marlene provided and what we found in the search, we have more than enough to prosecute." Detective Pierce leaned forward, her voice softening slightly, but still the voice of someone who never lets emotion overtake the job. "Mrs. Cross, I have to ask, how do you feel? Knowing your son planned to kill you, it isn't easy to face." The question made me pause. I realized I had been running on pure logic all day. Events, evidence, legal procedure. I had tried not to let my heart be allowed to feel. But when the detective asked, the pain rose like water through a crack. "I keep thinking about when he was little," I said quietly. "Darius used to be so sweet. He would pick flowers from the garden and bring them inside, telling me I was the most beautiful mother in the world. The day his father died, he held my hand at the funeral and promised he would take care of me forever." My voice caught on the last sentence, but I forced myself to keep going, because if I stopped, I was afraid I would break right here. "I don't know. When that little boy turned into someone who could look me in the eye and still planned to kill me. I don't know when I stopped being his mother and became just an obstacle to an inheritance." Detective Pierce nodded, her eyes holding the kind of compassion that comes from seeing greed destroy families that only seemed happy. "People change, Mrs. Cross," she said. "Sometimes greed and obsession can swallow everything else, even love. What your son did doesn't reflect what kind of mother you were, and it doesn't reduce the love you once had for him." Leaving the interview room, I stood in the station hallway, watching doors open and shut endlessly. Every time a door swung open, a life was pulled in a different direction. Some walked in with hope, some walked out in handcuffs. And I suddenly thought, I survived. But the price of surviving was having to witness the cruelest truth of all, that the person who wanted me dead was the one who once called me Mom. But what chilled me even more was another thought. If they were willing to go this far to take the company, how many more secrets were there that I still didn't know? And when the final secret came out, who would it drag down with it? 3 weeks later, I sat in the front row of the Suffolk County Supreme Court, watching my son led into the courtroom in shackles. Darius had grown thinner from his days in jail. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by an orange uniform, making him look smaller, not only in body, but because the power he once leaned on had been stripped away. Simone entered separately. Her blonde hair was tied back in a severe style, her face pale and bare of makeup. She stared straight ahead, not daring to glance in my direction. The woman who once smiled as she mixed poison into my coffee now didn't even have the courage to face my eyes when the consequences had arrived. The trial drew intense media attention. Mother targeted for murder by son and daughter-in-law was the kind of story that both horrified people and made them unable to look away. Prosecutor Renee Holloway warned me beforehand. Defense attorney Preston Hale would try to paint Darius as a victim of Simone's manipulation, despite the audio recordings showing both of them planned my death with the same eagerness. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Preston began, his voice booming, "this is a case about a young man in trouble who fell under the influence of a manipulative woman, one with a background in chemistry and a talent for psychological control." I looked at Darius. As Preston spoke as if defending him, there wasn't a trace of shame on his face. No guilt, not a single moment suggesting he understood what he had done. He let his lawyer push responsibility onto Simone, as if my life were merely an inconvenient detail in a play. The prosecution worked like a machine, tight, methodical, devastating. Detective Pierce testified about the evidence recovered from Darius and Simone's home and office. A medical examiner explained the mechanism of arsenic poisoning and just how close I had come to death. Then Marlene took the stand. She recounted each day, each observation, each sign. No screaming, no theatrics. The calmness and quiet dignity of it made her testimony powerful in a way that hurt to hear. When the recordings were played in court, the entire room went dead silent. Hearing Darius and Simone discuss my death in their own voices, joking about my suffering, talking as if they were planning a party, sent a wave of shock through every row of seats. Even Preston couldn't redirect the atmosphere. "I love you," Darius's voice echoed through the courtroom, praising Simone for calculating the arsenic dosage so perfectly. I looked at the jury. Someone grimaced as if truly nauseated. A woman in the front row burst into tears. The most damaging evidence came from Simone's own documents. Prosecutor Holloway displayed an enlarged projection of Simone's handwritten timeline, week by week, every sign of my declining health, every cold note like a lab journal. "The defendant didn't just plan to kill Mrs. Cross," Holloway said, her voice icy and sharp. "She enjoyed watching her suffer. She recorded every symptom, every sign of weakening, as if she were conducting research on how to kill someone, in the most efficient way." When it was the defense's turn, Preston called a few character witnesses about Darius being a good person before marriage. But their words were hollow against the weight of the evidence. Preston's strategy became clear when he called Dr. Patricia Vance, a psychiatrist specializing in psychological manipulation and coercive control. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Vance said, "Darius Cross shows clear signs of someone who was psychologically manipulated by a skilled predator." But Prosecutor Holloway's cross-examination was almost ruthless. "Dr. Vance," Holloway asked, "you claim Darius was coerced. So how do you explain someone being coerced into stealing $300,000 from his mother's business accounts?" "Well, financial crimes can sometimes accompany other forms of abuse." "Dr. Vance, did you listen to the recordings where Darius expresses pleasure at watching his mother suffer? Where he tells Simone he loves her because she was smart about planning a perfect murder?" Dr. Vance hesitated. "Victims of psychological manipulation can absorb the language and attitude of the abuser as a survival mechanism. So when Darius laughs about his mother's death and says he can't wait to inherit her money, that's trauma?" Even Preston looked uncomfortable as his expert witness was stripped down to the bone. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days I barely slept, sitting silently in my apartment and wondering, could justice be strong enough to beat family? When they returned, the foreperson stood. The courtroom held its breath. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, we find the defendant Darius Cross guilty." Darius's shoulders dropped, but his face remained empty. No tears, no remorse, nothing that looked human. "On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant Darius Cross guilty." The verdict for Simone was the same. Guilty on every count. And in that moment, I realized a painful truth. I didn't just lose my husband. I had also lost the son I once believed was mine. 10 years have passed since that October morning, the morning Marlene saved my life with nothing but a deliberate stumble, a whispered warning, and a spilled cup of coffee. This year, I am 74 years old. And as I sit in my garden, watching the sunrise slowly paint the sky in streaks of pink and gold, I can honestly say, these have been the most meaningful 10 years of my entire life. The house where Darius tried to kill me, I sold it only a few months after he was convicted. I couldn't bear living in rooms filled with memories, memories that turned my heart cold the moment I touched them. Instead, Marlene and I found a lovely little colonial home in Wellesley, far enough from Georgetown to feel like we were starting over, but still close enough that I didn't have to abandon my work and what we were building. Marlene lives in the guest house on the property, though to be honest, the line between guest and family disappeared a long time ago. She's 62 now, her hair completely silver, but her eyes still sharp, an intelligent clarity that once saved both our lives. We drink coffee together every morning, a ritual that began because I needed to be sure I was safe. But over time, it became something else, an anchor, a way to remind myself that love doesn't always come from the people who share your blood, and loyalty sometimes comes from the person society labels with a cold word, the help. Marlene still brews my coffee the way I like it. Careful, the right flavor, the right temperature. Only one thing is different now. Every time she sets the cup down, I no longer look at it with suspicion. I look at it as a symbol of life. The Cross Foundation has grown in ways I couldn't have imagined 10 years ago. What began as a way to turn pain into purpose has become a nationally recognized organization with offices in 12 states. We have helped prosecute more than 300 cases of elder abuse, recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets, and built a support network for victims who once believed they had nowhere to cry for help. Marlene is now the Foundation's national director, and she still keeps the habit that makes me laugh. She's both a director and the one who carries her own shopping bag, chooses her own vegetables, compares prices, and refuses to hire another housekeeper. "I know what happens when you trust the wrong person," she says, winking at me, her smile never losing its warmth, even though she has seen far too much of human darkness. 3 years ago, we opened the Marlene Booker Crisis Center, a residential facility for victims of elder abuse where they can stay safely while their cases are investigated. The day the cloth was pulled off the sign bearing her name, Marlene cried. She kept shaking her head, insisting she didn't deserve it. I remember taking her hand and saying right there, "Marlene, you saved my life when you had 100 reasons to stay silent. You risked everything to protect someone who couldn't protect herself at the time. If that doesn't deserve recognition, then I truly don't know what does." I never saw Darius again. He wrote letters from prison during the first few years, regularly, long-winded, sometimes begging, sometimes blaming, sometimes using words as if he were negotiating. I sent them all back, unopened, and gradually the letters stopped. I don't know whether he gave up hope or something happened in prison, and I chose not to find out. Sometimes people ask me whether I feel guilty for cutting off contact with my only child. Before, that question used to hurt. Now I answer directly, and far more calmly. I don't feel guilty for protecting myself from someone who tried to kill me. Forgiveness to me means I don't live with hatred as another kind of poison. But forgiveness does not mean I have to maintain a relationship with someone who abused me systematically. I can let go of resentment and still choose not to have Darius in my life. As for Simone, she died in prison 3 years after her conviction, killed by another inmate in a dispute involving smuggled cigarettes. When I heard, I didn't feel joy, and I didn't feel grief. Only a quiet, sad sense that a person who caused so much pain finally no longer had the power to cause more. Last week, we held a dinner to celebrate the Foundation's 10-year anniversary. The banquet room was filled with donors, volunteers, lawyers, social workers, people who had given their time and hearts to protect the vulnerable. As I looked around at those faces, I felt a deep, complete fullness in my chest, and I suddenly understood. This is what I wanted to do with my life. Not just run a successful business, not just raise a successful child by society's standards, but use my own experience of betrayal and survival to help others move from victimhood to empowerment, from fear to safety, from silence to being heard. This morning, after I finished my coffee and prepared to step into another workday at the Foundation, I thought about the woman I was 10 years ago, naive, trusting, desperate for family connection, even when that connection was quietly poisoning me. That woman could never have imagined the life I'm living now, the peace of relationships built on truth and choice, not obligation and manipulation, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the freedom of knowing exactly who deserves to stay in my life. Darius tried to steal my life for money he never even lived long enough to enjoy, but in the end, he accidentally gave me a gift, clarity about what truly matters, not bloodline or inheritance, but the courage to stand up for justice and the wisdom to recognize love when it arrives in forms you never expected. The cup of coffee that was meant to kill me became the catalyst that opened the most meaningful chapter of my life. Every morning, when Marlene and I share breakfast, every day, when we help one more victim find safety and justice, every moment, when we choose love over hatred, choose hope over despair, I feel as if I am drinking from a cup of coffee that represents survival, purpose, and the victory of kindness over evil. At 74, I feel more alive than I did at 64. At 74, I know who I can trust and why trust is still worth the risk when it's placed in the right hands. At 74, I understand that family isn't about blood or obligation. Family is the people who choose to protect one another, value one another, and never turn love into a weapon. The sun is fully up now, washing my garden in bright early light. Marlene will step out in a few minutes, as she does every day, to drink coffee with me. Then we'll begin another workday, making the world a little safer for the people who deserve protection and love. My name is Vivian Cross, a survivor of an attempted murder, the founder of a movement, and the mother of a family I chose rather than inherited. This isn't the life I planned, but it is the life I decided to live. And every day, with every cup of coffee shared in love instead of deceit, I celebrate the simplest miracle of all. I'm still here. If you want to keep walking with me through stories that are truly satisfying, where the truth is exposed, justice speaks, and good people finally get protected, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The next video has plenty of twists you won't see coming, and I don't want you to miss it.